Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back in another episode of Cheap Shots, and on today's episode we're going to show you guys how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up a war party of ash waste nomads for Necromunda ash wastes. So as you can see in this photo, this will be the end result for the gang, and by following the tips, tricks, and techniques that we recommend in this video, you're going to be looking at a grand total investment of $23.07 to paint up your ash waste nomads to a beautiful tabletop standard. Now when you compare that with the materials list that you will need from both Citadel as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total savings of $137.73. So with that being said, let's get this video on the roll and show you guys exactly how to cheaply paint up some ash waste nomads. Alright, so the very first step, of course, and this goes without saying, is to fully assemble your miniatures. As you can see in this photo, I actually have 4 Dustbite Helamites, which are the insect creatures that my fighters will be riding upon. I got those in my local Dollar Tree for about $1.25 per pair, and the rest of the miniatures are a combination of Adeptus Mechanicus for Warhammer 40,000 that have been converted with Genestealer Cult Arms, as well as some elements from Imperial Guardsmen. I was able to get these sheets of sprue from my local game shop for about 20 bucks, including the 32mm round bases that these guys are mounted upon. So once you have your miniatures fully assembled, the next thing to do, of course, is to texture the bases. So the next step, of course, is to texture your bases, and the easiest way of doing so, and perhaps the cheapest way that I found to do so, is to use a combination of glue as well as sand. And by sand, I mean sand that's outside that pretty much makes up the entirety of the planet. All you need to do, of course, is to put some sand upon the bases of your miniatures where you want texturing to be at, and then after that you just do a quick dusting with the sand that you've gotten outside over the bases. Now once that glue has dried, the next thing you need to do, of course, is to put a sealant on top of the texturing so that way it doesn't flake off your bases. I found that the best mixture to use is actually do a 50-50 mixture of glue as well as water. In this situation, I use wood glue and water. I mix it in a 50-50 ratio until about the wood glue is about the consistency of milk, and then from there I just paint it like a wash directly on top of the bases. And what this ends up happening is as this water glue mixture dries, it creates a airtight seal that goes over the top of the texturing to make sure that none of the texturing that you put on your miniature actually flakes off. And once, of course, that is done drying, next step involves priming. So the next step, of course, is to do a prime. In this case, I use cheap flat black spray paint that I got on my local Lowe's hardware store. Lowe's sells this beautiful flat black spray paint for 98 cents, and so that's what I use to directly create my primer. I just did a once over the entirety of the miniatures as well as the bases to give a good even coat of this black primer. Now, primer actually does a couple of things. The first reason why you want to use primer on your miniatures is because if you were to take acrylic paint and paint it directly onto bare plastic, the bare plastic does not have the surface tension that would be required to keep the acrylic paint on there. So unfortunately, if you were to do this without primer and you touch your miniature at all, you could rub off the paint and of course ruin the finish on your miniature as well. That is why primer is so important. Primer actually creates an uneven surface for your acrylic paint to adhere to, so that way it stays on better as well. Another reason why priming is important too is because the color primer that you have usually determines the vibrancy of the colors that you put on top of it. Traditionally speaking, the darker the primer, the more dark your paint job will be. So if you're planning for a darker color scheme or metallics, try to use a black primer. For those who are looking for a more vibrant and colorful look, you use a white primer, and for a happy medium you could use gray. Now in this situation, I use black primer for a couple of reasons. The first one is because I was using this as part of a $50 challenge that I had earlier about assembling a Necromunda gang for less than $50 or less. So I'm with a black primer because that's all Lowe's had at a really cheap price point, and that's the reason why I used it. The second reason why I use a black primer is because the color scheme that we're going with these guys involves a lot of dry brushing, especially when it comes to adding grays on top of a black surface, because I want to create this kind of dusty, ashy look for this gang, and so I figured black would be a perfect color for that. So once you prime your miniatures with your flat black spray paint, next thing to do, of course, is to do a series of dry brushes. So as you can see in this photo, I decided to divide the gang in half, and the reason why is because I wanted to add some more color variety to the dry brushing to this gang. Now originally I thought if I dry brushed one half of the gang in Skyline, another half of the gang in normal gray by Anita's acrylic, that would actually create some color variety. Unfortunately, that was not really all that important because as I got further along my dry brushing stage, I realized you really couldn't tell the difference between the two colors. But since I made that mistake and I've done that to my paint job, I might as well just include it in this one. The nice thing about that is, of course, if you make a mistake like I did, it's not going to break the bank because the paints are relatively cheap. In this case, I used Skyline by Folk Art for the 5 models on the left-hand side and Anita's acrylic gray on the models on the right-hand side. The Folk Art will cost you 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart, while the Anita's acrylic gray paint will cost you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. You just do a quick, simple dry brushing all over the entirety of the miniatures, and once you got a good, solid dry brushing that you're satisfied with, next step is another additional highlighting dry brush. Now the next step, of course, is to add additional highlighting on top of this. In this situation, I use Anita's acrylic slate blue for the 5 miniatures on the left-hand side and Folk Art's pale gray on the right-hand side. Once again, you're just doing a general dry brushing over the entirety of the miniatures. Dry brushing does a couple of things. The first thing it does allows the darker color to remain in the recesses of the miniature, while the actual pigments of the paint actually catches on to the raised surfaces. This gives the illusion of depth on your miniature, as well as creating artificial shadows as well as highlights, which is absolutely fantastic. And as you can see here, once again, these miniatures are a little bit brighter from the black base coat that we started them off with by doing this dry brushing. And finally, the last dry brush that we do one more time is a white dry brush, this time using Apple Barrel white paint, and we just give this a once over real fast with the white color in order to add that additional layer of dry brushing. And this is where my mistake came in. By putting this white dry brush onto the miniatures, while I did brighten them up to the level that I wanted to, unfortunately it also hit all the blues that I used for the Skyline, as well as the slate blue dry brushing that I did on the left hand side. So my recommendation is, if you decide to follow this technique, ignore the blues and grays, bluish grays that I used and the left hand side of the miniatures, and just stick with the overall gray, just because that white dry brush is going to do away with most of the blue that you saw earlier in the miniatures. But like I said before, this is the way I painted them up, and I'm going to be truthful in my recording about how I put these guys together. So it is kind of a costly mistake in the sense that you're probably losing, what is it, $1.40 in paint, but you know, like I said before, we're not really breaking the bank on this one. So now that we're done dry brushing the miniatures, as you see, we have this really beautiful dusty gray ashy look for these miniatures. And now we're going to start working on more of the design elements of these miniatures. And that next step, of course, is going to be the metallic elements. Now, regardless if you're using Adeptus Mechanicus miniatures like I'm using here, or if you're using actual Necromunda Ash Waste Nomads, it's all exactly the same concept. And the reason why is because there are a lot of metallic elements on both sets of gangs. For whatever reason, the design elements between Adeptus Mechanicus as well as Ash Waste Nomads are very similar. Both groups have no flesh exposed to the elements. Both groups have a lot of cybernetic parts attached to them. Both groups have respirators as well as tubes running out of their bodies. So you get it goes on and on. So for all the metallic elements on your miniatures, for cybernetics and tubing and different esoterica like mechanical equipment that's upon them, or their weapons, I suggest going with 4 very simple colors in order to paint those up. I would suggest going with Folk Arts Copper as well as Folk Arts Gunmetal Gray for all the parts you want to be copper as well as silver on your miniatures, and both those cost 75 cents at your local Walmart or your local Hobby Lobby. And then I recommend using Deco Arts Imperial Gold for all your gold elements, as well as Anita's Acrylic Bronze for all your bronze elements, and those colors will cost you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. As you can see in this photo, all I decided to do is pick out those metallic elements on the body that I want to primarily be gold, copper, bronze, or silver, and I just put 2 thin coats of these paints on top of that. And once, of course, you're done putting those base coats for these metallic elements, the next thing to do now, of course, is to break up these metallic elements by adding more metallic paint. So the next step, of course, I decided to do things like paint the backpacks these guys are carrying as well as their weapons, and to alternate different metallic colors to break up the monotony of the single colors we put as a base coat. Now, the best way I suggest using this by going by a thirds style of painting. So for example, if your metallic element, for example, from one of the long rifles is primarily copper for the rifle, I suggest you break it up by adding a third of it to be silver for some of the elements, things like triggers and trigger guards, as well as the barrels of the weapon, and then maybe pick out other elements in gold, such as the filigree of the magazine, the magwell, or the chamber where the weapon is actually loaded up at. That way you create this breaking up appearance of all the different metallic elements and adds a lot of variety of color to your miniatures, even though you're primarily using metallics. For example, for the chest rigs of these guys, I basically covered their chest rig in one solid base coat for the chest rigs, but then like the little design element in the middle, I picked up another color to break those apart. For the helmets, I might paint the respirators one color, the top of the helmet another color, and the lenses another another color. So that way it creates this nice variety of different metallics all over your miniatures. And oddly enough, once you are done with the metallic elements of your miniatures, most of the miniatures work is actually finished. All we really got to do at this point is to focus on the finer details. So one of those diner details, of course, involves a dry brush. I took Anniversary Silver, which is made by Folk Art, which is a very lustrous, bright silver color, which costs you about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart, wherever you decide to shop at. I just did a quick dry brushing over all the metallic elements, regardless of what color I use for the base coat. What this does, it actually creates this kind of shimmering / weathered look on all the metallic elements that you've just did. As you can see, the color vibrancy of those metallic elements have been muted down a little bit, and you have like this kind of weather-beaten look going on for the metallic elements, like in the weapon, the armor, as well as the backpacks. And once you do a quick dry brush with that Folk Art, next thing to do, of course, now start working on the finer details like the coats. Now this next step is actually entirely optional for you. If you want to skip this step, that's perfectly fine, but I want to add a little bit more color variety to the miniatures that I had in this gang. I could have left them all, of course, having that dusty gray looking overcoat, but I thought it was kind of boring having all the gangs be the same color. After all, I did try to break it up with that bluish dry brushing in order to add some color variety to these guys, but it didn't end up working. So in order to solve this problem, I decided to use Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel and decided to use that color by glazing the coats, long coats, about half the gangs to give this kind of dusty, kind of leather brown look to the trousers or to the jackets of the miniatures. In which case, if you wonder what glazing is nothing more than taking your paint and mixing it with water, about a 50-50 mix. And what this does, it creates a very loose kind of wash for your miniature, or basically a glaze. All you need to do, of course, is take this substance and paint it on like you would a wash on the parts of your miniatures that want to be brown. Now, I know what you're thinking. A lot of people are thinking, well, Commander Cheapskate, by doing this, aren't you diluting the pigment of your miniature? And the answer is yes, you are, and that is the point. And the reason why is because when you use glazing like this on the jackets, especially for these Ash Waste Nomads, the dry brushing that we did earlier actually bleeds through because the pigment is not very strong by glazing over the coats. So I added about 2 layers of this glazing on top of the dry brushing that I did to give this kind of like stained up, dusty ash look to the brown that we actually put on these guys, and added an overall excellent effect. Now, unfortunately, painting on a glaze for Apple Barrel paint, especially if you use craft paints to do this, it's not an exact science. It's anywhere between 2 to 3 coats, but it might involve more depending on how much water you added to your mixture. So you will have to be patient during this process, because once you apply it, you have to wait for it to dry before you apply another coat on top of it. So be wary of that. However, though, it does dry very quickly, and that is the flip side because of all the water content. And once you get your jackets to the vibrancy of the brown that you want to be, next thing you need to work on now are the fine details. Alright, so now we're working on the fine details of the miniature. These are things like the various tubes that are running out of their bodies, dials and diodes, as well as lenses from the miniatures. So as you can see in this photo, I divided the gang in half. Half of the gang I decided to paint in Mermaid Blue by Delta Sarin Coat. This costs you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And then for the other half, I decided to paint in Winter Green by Apple Barrel Paint, which costs you 50 cents. The reason why I picked these 2 colors is because they are stark contrast to the colors we've already put on the miniatures right off the start. The Winter Green is a beautiful contrasting color to all the metallics used, as well as some of the brown elements that we put on these miniatures from our glazing that we did in the earlier step. At the same time, the Mermaid Blue from Delta Sarin Coat is also a beautiful contrasting color, especially compared to the bronze and gold and copper elements that are on these miniatures as well. So we put this on all the tubes, the wiring, the diodes, the spark ignition chambers for the weapons, some of the vents on the weapons as well as vents on the backpacks, and also the lenses on the eyes as well as the backpacks as well, to kind of break up the color scheme a little bit and to add some diversity of color to this. And once we are done with that, next thing we start working now is on the other finer elements like the leather. Alright, so now that we're done with that, next thing to do, of course, is start working on the bases. So the things we're going to work on, of course, is using 2 thin coats of pewter gray by Apple Barrel Paint. This costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. And the reason why I'm using the pewter gray and not as much as the Anita's gray acrylic is because I ran out of Anita's gray acrylic while I was painting this up. So luckily for me, though, I did have some pewter gray, and that's the reason why I put that on the bases. All I need to do, of course, is to put 1 single layer of this pewter gray on top of the black texturing on the bases. Now, of course, some of the black will bleed through some of the gray, but that is perfectly fine because we're going to be dry brushing these bases anyways, and also put an oil wash on top of it, so any black that shows through is just going to add to the overall effect that these guys are walking on a burnt out wasteland. And as you can see in this photo, I decided to do a quick dry brush real quick using the Folk Arts Pale Gray. Just did a quick dry brush over the entirety of the texture of the bases. That nice pewter gray is still stuck in the recesses with some of the black undercoat bleeding through. And at the same time, we got that nice pale gray highlighting going on with the texturing by doing that dry brush. And we're actually going to stop the process right now for the miniatures at this stage for Ash Waste Nomads. And the reason why is because we also have to paint up the insects these guys will be riding for their Dustback Helmets. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. Alright, so the rest of the video, of course, is based on the Dustback Helmites. So as you can see here, we have those 4 insectoid miniatures that we had earlier, and all I did in this photo is I just put 2 thin layers of burnt over the entirety of the miniature. And the reason why is because these Dustback Helmites are actually quite fast to paint, and when you look at insects, most insects are monotone in color anyways. They're either largely one color for the most part, so it makes painting of these insects extremely easy. So all I do is, of course, is just put 2 thin layers of burnt over top of the black that we did earlier, and then once that dries, we move on to a dry brush. Alright, so the very first dry brush that they put on these miniatures, of course, is a real quick dry brush of Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. This runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart, and as you can see in this photo, do a really quick dry brush all over the burnt umber that we put on these insects earlier. And as you can see, we leave that darker burnt umber in the recesses of the miniature, while that Territorial Beige does a beautiful job of catching the raised surfaces, adding some depth and texture to these insects. And once we're done with our Territorial Beige, the last step for these guys is to put another brighter highlight on top of that. Alright, so once again, just do another quick dry brush, this time using Khaki Paint by Apple Barrel Paint. As you can see, it brings the brightness of these miniatures up to another level, make them look a little bit more pale and crusted, like their armor's been dried out and bleached out by the sun. And once, of course, we get done with that dry brushing with the Khaki Paint, we're going to do one more dry brush on top of that, just to give them that ashy, dusty appearance. And once again, we're going back to Pale Gray by Folk Art to do that very last dry brushing on top of these miniatures. And like I said before, the reason why is because we want to give this really dried out, husky kind of ashen look to these insects. After all, the Dustback Helmites are native to the surface of Necromunda, and they'll be covered in ash and soot, and also been, you know, kind of bleached out by the baking sun from the Season of Flames. And once we're done with the dry brushing for these Dustback Helmites, next thing we need to do now is start working on the finer elements. Alright, those final elements, of course, is to paint the eyes of these Dustback Helmites. These miniatures have 8 eyes, 4 per segment on the left and right hand side. And as you can see in this photo, I use a series of different colors to do this, and the reason why is that way my players who decide to use these guys can have an easier time differentiate between the different Dustback Helmite riders. So one, I paint up the eyes in Mermaid Blue, another one in Winter Green, another one would be done in King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint, which runs you 50 cents, and the other one is an Nita's Acrylic True Red, that's cost 65 cents as well. Just put 2 thin dots of the color choice that you want through the eyes, and as you can see there, they're pretty much done with. So now that we're done with our Dustback Helmites, we go back to our Ash Waste Nomads and apply an oil wash. And once again, since this is a quick paint method, we are doing an oil wash for all over the miniatures. In this case, I highly recommend using Midwax Polyshades Mission Oak color. It does exactly the same thing as Army Painter. Now, Army Painter, of course, is a beautiful product. It does exactly as advertised. The only difference, though, is that Army Painter Strong Tone costs $32 per can, while Midwax Polyshades only costs $7 per can. So because all you gotta do, of course, is just mix the Polyshade acrylic, add it like a wash to whatever brightness or darkness that you want in your miniatures, and apply it all over the miniatures. Apply it all over the Ash Waste Nomads, as well as the texturing on the bases, as well as the entirety of the surfaces of the Dustback Helmites. Now, when this stuff dries, I rather recommend you wait 24 hours for this product to dry as well as cure. And the reason why is because the Polyshade is a mixture of stain and polyurethane, so it will stain down your miniatures, it will darken down the vibrancy of the colors, but it will also add a thin layer of polyurethane in order to protect your miniatures as well. Now, the Polyshades does a couple of things. The first thing it does, of course, is it darkens down the vibrancy of the colors that we use to paint up these miniatures. As you can see, they have a more bleak, kind of somber look with these guys because the Polyshade is muting out the color. The next thing the Polyshade does as well is it also smooths out the transitions between our base coats and our dry brushes by getting rid of that chalky pastel appearance by doing so. And by blending those colors, we have a more organic looking transition from shadows all the way up to highlights. And finally, the last thing that the Polyshade does, of course, is seeps into the recesses of the miniatures, bringing out that detail that we did not see earlier. So as you can see now, we can see a lot of detail that was not present before in the miniatures. At the same time, we also stain the ground on which these Ash Waste Nomads walk on. Now, like I said before, you will need to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and fully cure, because if you try to handle these miniatures before the 24-hour mark, it could ruin your finish on your miniatures by actually rubbing off the paint that you actually put onto them. So the reason why I'm talking about that is because I'm actually talking from experience on that one. And that pretty much makes up this step for this part. Now, once you're done with the miniatures and they're all finished up with their oil wash, the next thing to do, of course, is to do a quick matte varnish on these miniatures if you want to. It's completely optional. I like using Cryolong matte varnish. It cost me $3.99 at my local Walmart, and all I do is just do a quick once over on my miniatures with that matte varnish to mute down the shine, or the sheen rather, of the Polyshades polyurethane. And then once we're done with that, the last thing to do, of course, is to rim the bases with 2 thin coats of Folk Art Skyline to give that kind of urban bluish gray look that I do for all the Necromunda miniatures, and we're going to be finished with these miniatures. And once again, this is the end result that we talked about earlier with our cheapskate method. We're talking about a grand total investment of $23.07. And when you compare the shopping list from Citadel as well as Army Painter Citadel will require your shopping list will cost you $160.80. And when you subtract the $23.07 for the cheapskate method, you're talking about a grand total savings of $137.73. So that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and talk about the shopping list from Citadel and Army Painter that you will need to have in order to paint up your miniatures to have the exact same standard, but using their products. Alright, so first of all, you need to buy a pot of Sterling mud from Citadel, which costs you $7.80 to put the texturing on your miniatures, and then you need to spray all your miniatures down with Chaos Black Spray, which runs $17. After that, you'll need to do successor dry brushes of Slanesh Gray, Rust Gray from Region Gray, as well as Ulthuan Gray and White Scar, and all 4 of those colors cost you $4.55. Now for the metallic elements, you'll need to use Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, as well as Retributor Armor, which costs you $7.80 for all the copper and metallic parts that you've done to the miniatures, and then you need to dry brush them with Iron Breaker for another additional $7.80 for that pot. Now for you to do the brown coats on the miniatures, you need to buy a pot of contrast snakebite leather, which is $7.80 for that. And for all the turquoise as well as winter green design elements, you need to buy pots of Talazar blue and Gauss Blaster green. Talazar blue runs you $7.80 for that, $7.80 for that, while Gauss Blaster green runs you $4.55. Now then, for the territorial beige dry brushing, you'll need to buy Baylor brown, which costs you $4.55. And for the dustback Helamites, you need to buy Morghast bone for the dry brushing, as well as Everland Sunset and Mephiston Red for the eyes, which runs you $4.55 a piece for those. Finally, you'll need to do a overall oil wash with Army Painter Strong Tone, which costs you $32 even. And when you pad all these materials up together, assuming you're purchasing out for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $160.80. And when you combine that with the cheapskate method of $23.07, total savings of $137.73. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can quickly and easily paint up your guys' Ash Waste Nomads for Necromunda. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.